it's a weird profession, selling aeroplanes for Airbus or Boeing, because when you win, you have euphoria for about 24 hours, and when you lose, you have depression for about 6 months.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavant of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who are we talking with today?
Today we're talking to Andy Shankland. And obviously you know Andy well. Andy has a pretty nice career in aviation, so it'll be fun to kind of chat with him, similar to some of our previous guests, but I think Andy's got a different take on it, so it'll be really cool to talk to him. But so Andy is currently managing director and partner at Seabury Aviation Partners, which just recently merged with Plainview Partners. So he was with Plainview and they merged together. So now he's with Seabury. Be interesting to kind of hear about kind of the new dynamics with that new organization. Prior to that, he was executive director at Plainview Partners. Before that, he had I think a pretty long career at Airbus North America as SVP leasing, and then he had various roles in marketing, business development, airline marketing, as well at Airbus as well. He was also in marketing at British Aerospace, so he has probably some interesting stories, just like Chris Jones did, regarding the Avros and all that good stuff, all those great four-engine aircraft. And he also holds a degree in chemical engineering from Imperial College of London. So it's going to be great to speak with him today. So Andy, this is your time on wing.
Just a quick intermission before we continue with the show. We do get a lot of questions about how our listeners can support the show, and frankly, the easiest way is to continue the spirit of the show, which is just to reach out to us at conferences. But we also run businesses as well, and you can support us by supporting a lot of the work that we do. You can support the work that I do through Visual Approach by visiting visualapproach.io, where we produce a lot of research and analysis, a lot of data visualizations.
From my side, obviously, I focus more on the metals, so anything that's aircraft related, if you're looking for valuations, whether it's on aircraft engines, I'm happy to help with any of those types of projects. So we appreciate certainly the opportunities to work with all of you. And we certainly also appreciate just the fact that people are willing to listen to what we have to say and enjoy kind of our thoughts and takes on what we think is a fascinating industry. So thank you.
Okay, back to the show.
So Andy, thank you very much for coming on the show today. It's definitely a pleasure to have you on to talk to us about kind of your background and what your thoughts are on the industry. So if you've listened to some of the past shows, you'll know that I always ask kind of the same starting question, which is kind of, how did you get your start in aviation? Where did the passion come from? It's always so interesting to hear. So we'd love to hear yours.
Super. Well, hey, thank you very much for the invitation, and a pleasure to be with you today. Boy, we're going to go back a long time if we go back to sort of where my interest in aviation came from.
Does it include biplanes?
Not quite.
Okay.
Almost. It does include. It includes comets. We'll get onto that in a little while. I mean, hey, I was a child. So I really am going back to the beginning, guys. So I was
Perfect.
a child of the late 60s. I wish I could tell you that I remember England winning the World Cup in 1966, but I don't, so I'm waiting for the next time that we do. Still waiting.
Keep holding your breath.
I can remember life from, let's say, 1970 onwards. I was still a kid in the UK. And I guess my family, we were probably the first generation of Brits that habitually got on an aeroplane to go on holiday. To Spain or Greece or wherever. And that must be because I don't remember a defining moment, but all I can tell you is the only thing as a child that I ever wanted to do was to be a commercial airline pilot. So I'm already envious of Courtney because he had that opportunity. And I guess it was to do with the fact I was flying on vacation, with the family to go on holiday, which is fine. So then fast forward, how do I actually try to get into aviation? So when I was leaving school and thinking about going to college in 1980, still a long time ago, it was not, well, two things. First of all, there was no commercial airline jobs. It wasn't a good time for the industry. Secondly, my eyesight was not great, so no way could I have gone into the RAF. That just wasn't going to happen. So I decided but I did study engineering. I actually did chemical engineering for what it's worth at university. So then you could say, why didn't you study aeronautical engineering? And that was simply because at the time I thought if I wasn't going to be a pilot, then I didn't want to be involved, and go and do something else. But when I started at college, I started flying gliders, or sailplanes as they're known in the US. It's great fun. Anyone out there thinks I don't do it now, but I can thoroughly recommend it as a relatively cheap way to get into a cockpit if you take up gliding. I mean, when you do that in the UK, because of the weather, it involves a little bit of flying and a lot of time sitting in pubs with your friends. So it's a very social activity amongst other things. So then I leave college, and it just so happened that my first job in the chemical industry, therefore, was based in the Middle East. At 22, I was living in Dubai and then Bahrain. So I was flying a lot as a passenger, and I just thought, geez, you know what? Even if I'm a baggage handler, I want to get into this aviation. And I applied. Then, if you remember an airline in the UK, they were subsequently bought by BA, but British Midland, very solid airline at the time in the UK. By this time, they had an ab initio pilot cadet program. And I'd gone from gliding and got a private pilot's license. I could get a class 3 medical required to fly privately, but I couldn't get what I was subsequently to learn was I couldn't get a class 1. So I was actually accepted by British Midland to be a pilot trainee, which was fantastic, until I'd failed the medical on the grounds of the eyesight, unfortunately. So that was a dark day. So that was, the prospect of me, just to answer your original question, always wanted to be a pilot, but the prospect of me being a commercial pilot ended at that time. No laser surgery. I wonder what would have happened actually if there had been laser surgery available at that time, but it wasn't. So then I had to rethink, and I had a number of moves. I moved. Next thing, wanting to work in aviation, was I got a job. I got a number of jobs from the back pages of Flight International, great magazine as it was. And I got a job for working for Seabury, which is I don't know if they still are, a Swiss chemical company, but they manufactured composite materials. So linkage between my background in chemical engineering and aviation. And I moved into sales, and I was selling composite materials at that time for Seabury to the manufacturers, people like Fokker and ATR. And just little stories along the way. I guess the first one would be, I think we were individually responsible for holding up the first flight of the Fokker 50.
Well done.
Because, it was we manufactured the floor panels, and apparently, I'm going back in, dredging my own memories here, but from memory, apparently in the F-50, the floor panels are part of the structure. Normally if you go into an aeroplane in production, you can almost put plywood on the floor beams and just walk over it. It's okay. But in the F-50, the composite finished flooring is part of the structure. And therefore, because we were late, they couldn't move the first flight test article down the production line. So I remember we hired, myself and a colleague, we hired a van, and we drove from our facility in Duxford, which is a great aviation location. There's a great aviation museum there, by the way, in Duxford, Cambridgeshire, to Amsterdam to hand deliver the first set of F-50 floor panels, so the F-50 could trundle down the line. So I did that for a couple of years, and then back pages of Flight International again. British Aerospace were looking for marketing folks. So I had managed to get a job with BAE, which was fine, and moved into their marketing department. And first time, therefore, talking about aircraft, which was really what I've done for the last 35 years, as Courtney knows to some extent. So I was marketing at the time the BA 146, which I'm sure you'll be. I'm hoping there's a model there somewhere, but 146.
No.
Do you have one, Garrett?
I do not. That would be so cool, though. But I'm sure, apparently, I'm sure Andy has one. There you go.
Oh, very
Look
nice.
at that.
That's a 146. That's not the Avro,
The
right?
Whisper Jet, as it was known.
The Whisper Jet, yeah.
So the 146, which I'll come back to, the BA ATP, which stood for Advanced Turboprop, and clearly it was so advanced nobody bought it. I think we built about the same number of aircraft as Airbus built of 340, 200s. That it just wasn't successful. Ultimately, it was a derivation of the HS748 and was I don't know if it was over-engineered, but was too expensive versus the competition. And then also the Jetstream 3141, which for a period of time were quite successful. And I certainly flew on a bunch of them as passengers once I'd moved to the US. So I worked for British Aerospace for 5 years. And at that time, and I'm just talking, please stop me when you want me to stop.
No, keep going. This is great. Yeah.
Okay, so fast forward 5 years. Now we've leapt into the 1990s. I'm pleased to report it's 1992. And so in those days, if you recall, British Aerospace was a full partner in the Airbus consortium. And as a result of that, it wasn't too difficult to get a secondment from BA, we say down, because Toulouse is south of England, obviously, down to Airbus. So myself and a couple of colleagues applied to get that secondment. I was actually rejected the first time. I kept the rejection letter. Airbus said, thanks, but no thanks. And then a few months later, they must have been, a bit like this podcast, they must have been running out of people to ask. So finally they came back to me. And in 92, I was seconded from BA to Airbus again in marketing. But if you think of the history, it was the BA as a manufacturer of their own regional aircraft was approaching the end. The 146, and then it was called the RJ, sort of limped along for a number of years afterwards, but the writing was on the wall. So while it was a secondment, it was sort of like implicitly a one-way ticket, which was fine. And I joined Airbus in 92. A word on the old 146, because we won't come back to it afterwards, right? It was amazing machine. The history was, as I recall, being told the history in a way, is the idea at the time was like the 50-seat turboprops were doing a great job, but hey, fuel was really cheap, so why don't we design a jet that can do the same job as a turboprop, just do it a bit more quickly? And that's why the 146 has a wacky sort of high-wing 4-engine design, because it was designed to literally get it, which it could do, get in and out of airfields that those turboprops could. But the old 146 only had a range of about 1,300 nautical miles. So it was inherently limited in what it could do. But if you wanted it to do the job it was designed for, it did a great job. So the reason I've kept this particular model, which is from Drukhair in Bhutan, is because at the time, I think they fly 319s now, but at the time the 146 was the only jet that could get in and out of Bhutan. It was a great country to visit as we were marketing the aircraft there.
So I'll test your engineering memory and ask why there were 4 engines on the 146. Wrong answers only.
There is only one answer, and the answer is because the wings were not long enough to accommodate 6.
There you go. He got it. That's it.
Textron-like homing, ALF, can't remember the designation, 6,700 pounds of thrust per engine. So the engine, apparently, which was perhaps not a great idea, came out of a tank. Literally, it was originally designed for a tank, and somehow found its way into the 146. So reliability was not necessarily its greatest asset. Now, it did have a gearbox as well, and perhaps
it was a
later
GTF,
in our discussion,
wasn't it?
That's what I wanted to get to eventually.
I'm sorry. I ruined it.
No. We need to talk about other stuff in the meantime. When we get to re-engineering programs and Neos, I can talk a little bit about Pratt & Whitney experience with the GTF. But yeah, the engine in the 146 had a gearbox as well.
And I did not realize that Lycoming had an original life as a tank mover. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Hence the gear, right? I mean, it
so
turns the gear.
Going into, I mean, on the basis the podcast is more about stories than anything else. I mean, back in those days, and it might actually still be the case. I actually don't know. I haven't been fortunate enough to visit Bhutan for 30 years. I mean, it's a great country. I'm sure it still is, with great people, by the way. But in those days, certainly with the 146, it was basically you had to have VFR conditions to get down into it. So, I mean, it's famous, and you can watch YouTube videos, and I actually don't really appreciate the intent, because I see people saying, we're flying into the most dangerous airport in the world. Well, it's not the most dangerous airport in the world. You just need to be, conscious of what you're doing. So certainly in those days, there was a beacon on a mountain, and as a passenger, you'd launch out of Bangkok. You'd stop in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and then you'd be sort of wondering what the weather was like, because usually it was cloudy in the morning, every morning, above the airport in Paro, Bhutan. And you'd launch off on the hope that, as it usually did, the clouds would disperse and the pilots would have VFR conditions. Now, maybe they use like RMP now, and it's not so essential. I don't know, but in those days, I don't think I ever got to Bhutan on the day I was meant to get there. In effect, it was either because we never got out of Bangkok, or because we'd go and orbit around Paro for a period of time and then go back to Dakar. So wow. It was challenging, but once you got there, it was a great place, and I'm sure it still is.
And it was the only airplane that could operate out of Bhutan because of the engine out performance. Is that right?
Yes, I mean it's very. Probably a number of reasons. The runway is pretty short. I don't know if it's been extended, and I don't specifically know the conditions under which, and I think they've flown 319s for quite a few years now, under which the 319 performs. The only thing I would mention is, I mean, if you're not flying that far, then a 319 is not going to be having to get in or out of there at its maximum weight, and I imagine that's partially what makes it doable. But engine out performance, that is something in relation to four engines versus two, which we should also come on to, because I guess I've been fortunate enough over my career to market a number of them: the 146, various variations of the A340, and also the A380. So been involved in a number of four-engined programs over the years.
So it's your fault
that they're not being. Is it my fault they're not being built anymore?
No,
is that what you're saying?
No. Just the idea of these later four-engine airplanes. We have you to blame, I guess.
So all right. So now we're into Airbus. Now, so when I joined Airbus, it was in the early days. So that was 92. So the 320 was up and running. 320 entered service in 1988. I mean, selling a 320 was not a piece of cake right. in those days. The aeroplane did not have a fantastic track record from a point of view of safety at the very beginning, and in addition, generally was viewed as being a very complicated machine, and therefore, how could it be efficient and low cost if it's complicated? So we can certainly talk about 320s, but on four-engine programs, well, that was the A340. And I mean, the Airbus idea at the time was to have one platform, which was the A330, A340, but have a sort of medium-range version, which was the A330. Obviously now that's evolved into quite a long-range aeroplane, to be fair, with the 330neo. And then separately to have a four-engine variant to compete with sort of Boeing longer range aircraft at that time. So I mean, hey, I wasn't around during sort of the design phases of the 330, 340. I can't talk about those. Certainly, we were heavily marketing at the time the 340-300 versus the 777-200 ER. And to be fair to the old A340, I mean, it's not a rocket ship, and I can explain a little bit about that. But it wasn't. It held its own for a period of time against the 777. There are certain features about a four-engined aircraft that, under some circumstances, make it quite relatively economical versus the twin. But obviously, what happened? Well, let's talk about engine outperformance, because we might as well do that now. And I imagine some people know about this and some people don't. And this is true for all four-engined aircraft versus twins. So if you sit at an airport, I did this at Chicago one day, decades ago. I was waiting for a flight and just watched all the aeroplanes launch off, off the same runway. And you could see very clearly that all the twins, I mean, I think the 757 probably most notable, but all the twins would sort of launch off and they sort of looked as if they were gaining altitude at a fast rate. And really all the four-engined aircraft, so predominantly 747s and A340s, didn't have that level of performance at all. Now, to be totally honest with you, I think the 747 was better than the 340-300 in that case. But the reason for the difference is because all aircraft are certificated from a point of view of their takeoff performance on an engine-out basis. And then the maths are very simple. The twin is in effect overpowered. It has to be designed to be overpowered to allow for the fact that, usually a sort of V1 type engine failure is the limiting case, that you can still get away on one engine. And Courtney, from your old flying days, I'm sure I don't know if you've had one in real life, but I'm sure you've done lots of simulators where you have to actually show that that's the case. So under those circumstances, the four-engine plane still got three engines left. And as a result of that, it doesn't need to be with all engines operating as let's say, overpowered as any twin does. And that's why you get into the fundamental difference in the standard of performance. Now, having said that, I think it's fair to say that in the ideal world, the 340-300 would probably have had an extra couple of £1,000 on each engine. And I imagine, and I genuinely don't know, but I imagine that the reason it didn't was simply because it wasn't possible. I mean, that's a theme which is something that I'm not sure is entirely understood, is that the ability of the airframe manufacturer to design any airframe is inherently in tandem with the ability or willingness of engine manufacturers to provide an engine with the right operating economics, including thrust level. And I just don't think you could have squeezed anything more out of a CFM56 than was done. I think it was £36,000 from memory in a 340-300.
But at the time, the CFM56 was not yet as venerable. I guess this was the mid 90s, so I guess you did have the classic, the 300, 400. So okay,
and the 320 as well, which was always available with two engines, the V2500 and the CM56. But certainly the £36,000 application on the 340-300 was the highest that's ever been seen with CFM. I mean, we would now I'm thinking again more sort of stories as here is, I mean, we did things like, when I say Airbus and we, it's when I was there, because now I'm completely, and I'm genuinely ambivalent and very happy to talk positively about Boeing aeroplanes, but I wasn't capable of doing that when I was at Airbus at the time. So, I mean, in the context of marketing 340s, we did things like we would go down to the level of looking at the fuel density at each individual airport to squeeze a few more joules out of the available fuel and therefore gain a few more miles in terms of distance, because we had a little bit of a range shortfall. And we also looked at and obviously the history tells us that Airbus got it wrong in this case. I mean, we also looked at should you have an engine failure in a big twin. And one of the features in that situation, obviously, is you have to land at the nearest available airport. If you have an engine failure in a four-engined aircraft, you have the ability, if you choose to continue the flight. That may or may not be a good idea to do, but you have the ability to do so. With a twin, you just can't. You've got to go to the nearest place. So, if you've launched out of LA on a nice summer's day, and you're heading to Hong Kong on a hot, humid day, and you've just got your summer gear, if you land in some place in the north of Greenland or the very north of Canada, you're going to struggle. It's not going to be great for the passengers. And we even concluded that under some circumstances, if the big twin diverted to one of these places that would have amongst other things, no hotels, there was even a question of preservation of life. If you're stuck for days, the APU, you run out of fuel eventually. What are you going to do?
Yeah, zombie apocalypse, more survivable.
It was perhaps a little bit. In the end, it hasn't. Twin-engined aircraft have diverted to pretty weird places, but I don't think the circumstances have been quite as severe as Airbus predicted. We also, at the time, we genuinely thought, and again, we obviously got it wrong. We genuinely thought that in the blade out case for a GE90, the level of vibration as a result of that would be so severe that the pilots wouldn't be able to read the instruments, and it would be a really sort of terrible scenario. And again, though, the tale of the tape is that the four-engined aircraft didn't work out, and we're not going to see them again probably ever. And twin-engined, I think engines in general, and the reliability that we see from these big engines on these long flights. I happened to take a 15-hour flight on Tuesday, and we came over it wasn't quite the North Pole, but we came over the very northern tip of Greenland. I'm not sure there's very many places to set down there, and I was relying on a couple of Trents, Rolls-Royce Trents, which fortunately got us to the destination.
Roll of the dice there, Andy.
I do think about that. Honestly. Call me old-fashioned, but when I went...
That's not fair. They're still good.
Any of these flights, you get on, you have a bite to eat, you might have a couple of drinks, you watch a film and you fall asleep, and then you inevitably wake up in the middle of the flight. And being an aviation guy, I've got to put the map on, even the camera, even though there's nothing to see usually on the cameras, but put the map on and see where I am. And I think, I'd much prefer to have four engines if I could. But the engines are remarkable. I think the level of technology and what's been achieved with engines is absolutely amazing. It's actually more so than on the airframe side.
Yeah. But if those engines had not been as reliable as they turned out to be, I think that's a very reasonable argument, especially from the position or from the time that you were looking at it, right? Because looking back from that period, engines had not been as reliable as they were looking forward, and it just didn't happen enough, right? The reliability was just so good. But I am interested in the, just the idea of the engine out scenario, what that actually means when you're talking a twin versus a four-engine aircraft, because it's not. Most people think that if you lose an engine, you're down 25% of your power versus 50% of your power, but it's way more than that. You've turned something that's making the airplane go to now forcefully just trying to slow it down. It's now a giant barn door, as we always used to call it. So it's more than just the 50% that the twin is losing, and it's only slightly more than the 25%. Does that make sense? On the four-engine.
I guess on the twin, there's fundamentally there's more asymmetric. You've lost all the thrust on one side. So, the aeroplane wants to fly sideways a lot more than it does. Here's a good example. So, I'm at Airbus, and I get to go on a delivery flight. It's the only delivery flight I've ever been on. It happened to be, I won't name the airline. They probably wouldn't mind if I did, but I won't name them. It happened to be the first A340-300 delivery to this airline. And they chose to send a whole bunch of employees over to celebrate, as airlines sometimes do. That's not uncommon. It's a reward almost. Send a bunch of employees, in this case, to Toulouse. I'm sure they do the same to Seattle. And have a great time for a couple of days, and everyone fly back on the delivery flight. So we had the crew, we had a few Airbus people like myself, we had about 30 people from the airline in a 340-300. We take off out of Toulouse. It's a very jovial atmosphere. This is before 9/11. Anyway, it's not a scheduled flight, but the cockpit door was open and everyone was having a good time. And after about half an hour, the captain comes on and says, "I'm terribly sorry, but we're having an issue with one of our engines, and what we're going to do is we're going to orbit here in order to dump fuel." Obviously, the aircraft would have been overweight otherwise. "And then we're going to go back to Toulouse." So first of all, nobody believed. We thought he was kidding. Until I looked out the window. It's quite something when you see the fuel jetting out of the port on both sides. We were dumping fuel. I remember he said we were orbiting at 14,000 feet. And here's the thing. I looked down. I expected to look down and sort of see the Bay of Biscay and see water. I looked down. Honestly, all I could see was vineyards.
Oh.
So I would just be slightly cautious.
What year was this?
Probably
What vintage?
1995, I think.
So the 95 vintage. Got
95 Bordeaux.
A little extra.
Yeah. Might avoid those. Now, I believe the theory, to be honest, I believe the theory is the fuel just disperses. It doesn't actually hit the ground. But anyway, we went back to Toulouse. It was a gearbox had cracked, engine gearbox had cracked, and had to do a quick engine change. And we got back on the plane and flew back a couple of days later. But the point being is, there was no physical sense in the aircraft that anything had happened at all. Obviously, they got an engine oil warning. They shut the engine down, and you just didn't know there was. And I think probably in a twin, you might, as a passenger, you might have got a sense of it.
The captain usually comes on and says, "Could everybody stand on the opposite side of the airplane to even it out?"
Yeah. Go look on that side. No, go look on this side.
Okay, we need to turn that way. Everybody lean. That was 95. So when did the 300 first enter service? 93,
right? Or 92?
You're testing me actually. 93 or 94, I think, and then the A330-300, because the 200 was launched later. 330-300 followed 2 or 3 years later.
And the idea behind the 200, I guess this is very similar to the 330-200 as well. Probably the same.
Oh, okay. I meant the 330-200. You mean the 340-200? They were 200s of both aircraft. So the 340, the A340-200 wasn't terribly successful, and I mean, shrinks fly further. And the basic premise is if you don't do anything else to it, if you stretch an aircraft, this is true for any aircraft program. If you stretch an aircraft, you get improvement in unit economics, most notably seat mile costs, but you lose range. And if you shrink a plane, you get the reverse. So the 340-200 would have flown a little bit further than a 340-300, but it never really had a huge amount of traction. And from memory, I think there were around 40 of them built, not that many.
But that kind of matches the market for like the 7.4 SP, right? Which was the same concept. Just shrink it and take it.
Yeah, that was quite a lot bigger. Of course, at the time.
But there were probably about that many SPs built, which was a shrink to increase the range.
Yeah.
It seems about the market size.
So the SP, I believe, I did fly on them on a couple of occasions. I believe the history is the SP was designed at the time to get from Europe to South Africa, obviously this is in the days of apartheid, and get where there was no overflight capability. And I think the idea was to get the range required to be able to do that. Very short looking. I mean, it's funny how your perception changes. And like as another example, the first time I saw a 777-300, I was sitting in Hong Kong airport waiting for a flight, which you spend a lot of your life doing when you're on the road. And this, you get the join between the windows. And the beginning of a 777 started to taxi past. I actually thought it was an optical illusion. I thought it can't possibly be that long. But now it's almost the reverse.
Yes.
And when I see, I was just had an opportunity to fly on a couple of 319s in Asia. I mean, it looks like a 318 now to my eye. An A319 looks like a very, very short, dumpy aeroplane, which it didn't do to my eye 20 years ago. We're still navigating through Airbus history, but just on that program, I mean, there was a time in the US when the only, certainly in the US, and I spent 15 years with Airbus in North America, the only member of the 320ceo family that really hit the nail on the head at the time was the A319. And 319s were being delivered to a large number of US airlines, and 320s were not, and 321s were certainly not. And at that time, I mean, the general view was a 319ceo was a fully transcon capable aircraft. The 320ceo did it, but could be a little limited. The 319 removed those limitations, and I think there was probably a little bit of the old, I think it was the Bob Crandall who was quoted as saying you could, at the time, you could never go bust if you flew an aircraft that was too small. So at the time, 319 was very, very popular in comparison. That's obviously flipped 180 degrees now, where
I was going to say,
321 is the popular variant.
That's
tells
the latest.
Me we'll hear that quote more and more here in the next couple of years, but that's interesting.
Yeah. So Andy, can you take us through, obviously your transition from Airbus? I guess what was the deciding factor for you to decide to leave Airbus and go into? Because then you went to Plainview after that, correct?
Yeah. So first of all, nothing bad. I mean, I was with Airbus for the best part of 25 years. Great company to work for, great industry to be in. Airbus, from a career standpoint, was very good to me. I started as a sort of junior marketing analyst, I guess, and I finished as an SVP. My last two jobs in Airbus were being head of marketing for Airbus at an interesting time when the Neo program was launched. So we can talk a little bit about that if you like. And then my very last job was head of Airbus leasing markets, and that doesn't mean, and both OEMs are similar here, leasing doesn't mean Airbus want to lease any aircraft, they just want to sell them. But they're very happy to sell the planes to the leasing community. And traditionally on the Airbus side, and I don't think it's changed dramatically since, about 25% of all production gets sold to the lessors as speculative orders, where the lessor orders the aircraft and then decides where they're going to place it. They do sale and leasebacks on top of that, but leasing is an important piece of the overall puzzle. So I had a great career, but for anyone who's done that job, we should talk a little bit about Airbus versus Boeing and my time versus John Ferren, because John was when I was at Airbus, John was for some years the counterpart at Boeing. But for anyone who's done that job, it's a weird profession, selling aeroplanes for Airbus or Boeing, because you work take a typical campaign with an airline. It lasts between 6 months and 2 years. You give it 100% effort 24/7, because the nature of the deal is it's a big transaction. There's a lot of dollars at stake. And, best case scenario, you've got a 50% chance of losing. And and I'm sure this is true for all, I think it's human psyche probably, when you win, you have euphoria for about 24 hours, and when you lose, you have depression for about 6 months. And I'm sure that's true of everybody who's ever done that job. It's just the way.
That's so depressingly true.
Yeah, so I mean, it's full on, and I had both the extreme pleasure and also the hardship of working for the great John Leahy for my whole career. And as I progressed, I sort of got closer to the point where I was a direct report for the last 10 years or so to John, and an amazing character, and produced amazing results. And Airbus absolutely would not be in a position it is today without the efforts of John Leahy and the team of people around him. But he's not the easiest person in the world to work for. And I mean, you just reach a point, in my case, in my early 50s, where you just sort of think, are things ever going to change? Can I progress? Progress further? Might I get paid a little bit more? Yeah, but is it ever going to change? And from overall quality of life standpoint, I just decided, because the strange thing is, and I think this is probably true in most companies, is you would think the higher up a company you go, the more you are in control of your own destiny. I actually think it's the reverse. And the higher up you go, the less you're in control, because you're being pulled in all directions all the time. And just decided it was time for a change. So yeah, I left in 2015, and I did not know that the plan was to have no plan for a period of time. And it was about 6 months later, in my case, when the guy who'd been my boss for about 15 years in Airbus North America, and another, I think I could say, an industry icon, Henry Couperon. Henry called me up and said, "Come on, Andy, you've been on the beach for a few months now. You must be getting bored. Why don't you come and join us at what was Plainview Partners, now Seabury Aviation Partners?" So I never thought I would be an aviation consultant or advisor. That was not part of the plan, although I've had a great time, I must say, over the last 8 years or so. So I joined PVP in 2016.
Wow. Yeah. And so I guess maybe talk to us a little bit about, I think, some of the things that you do now, which I would assume they're similar to what you were doing at Plainview just now for Seabury Aviation Partners, correct?
Yeah, so not to turn this into an advert for Seabury Aviation Partners, but as you mention it, so we're aviation advisors. In terms of the two companies, it's a merger of the two companies. I was lucky enough towards the end of my time at PVP to be a partner in PVP. Now I'm a partner in Seabury Aviation Partners, which is headed by John Luth and Mike Cox. Now, Seabury have been around a lot longer and are much bigger and have a much greater portfolio of capabilities and resume than PVP has. And actually, the reason why the merger made sense to both sides is because while there was a lot of commonality between the two companies, in fact, the other three partners in PVP, other than myself, at one point worked for Seabury, so a lot of commonality. There wasn't actually much overlap. We very rarely competed to try and win an engagement because the emphasis, the sort of directionally the emphasis of the expertise tends to be a little bit different. And on the PVP side, what we've focused more on, because of our respective backgrounds, we do other things too, is more the aircraft transactional side. So helping currently, in terms of a number of different airlines, helping them with aircraft and engine evaluations, negotiations, lease transactions, and the reason why there's a business there, why is it that anyone needs any help in the first place, is not because there's a lack of effort or, in many cases, knowledge on the airline side, but I would describe it this way. This is the way we describe it to our clients, is, that even a big airline who have people dedicated to the task might end up buying a bunch of planes once every couple of years or less than that. The folks you're dealing with on the other side, they're doing it. It's all they do in life. They're absolute professionals, and their job is not to give money away ultimately or give concessions away.
Right.
And therefore the art of the negotiation and the evaluation is something that, because we've done it for a long time and because we've done it on both sides of the table, I think that's the interesting thing where we perhaps bring some value that some other advisors don't, that we can genuinely say that we've literally sat on every side of the table. And when you know what the person on the other side of the table is thinking about, that generally helps in the context of the negotiation. So we've become Seabury Aviation Partners since the 1st of January 2024. And as a result of that, as part of the bigger organization, we have a much expanded, as a grouping, much expanded capabilities, and certainly feels like we're busy enough. I mean, as I can't name them, but as an example, I'm working on 3 different airline engagements at the moment, which in itself would, for me, historically, would be somewhat unusual. It would usually be 1 or 2 at the same time. And I mean, just to finish up with what's exciting about it is, well, 2 things for me personally. One is, for decades, I dreamt what it might be like to sit on the other side of the table and know what the airline were actually thinking and what were they doing. And then the second thing is the variety, that we don't have a geographical focus in that sense. So we have different clients, different airlines. We sometimes have certainly lessors as clients. We've also had OEMs and suppliers as clients in the past, but very, very varied opportunity to work with different folks in the industry in different parts of the world.
So when you saw the view from the other side of the table, was it everything you had ever dreamed of, Andy, or how was that? Was it a disappointment, or were they more capable?
Not a disappointment. Every airline's different would be my first comment. Both the way they approach the same project and the expected outcomes will be different. I would say there's an area of the business that when I worked for Airbus, I just didn't appreciate both how complicated it was and how it can impact the answer very dramatically. And that genuinely would be everything related to engines. And I'm not just talking about the fact that the engine manufacturers don't seem to be doing a great job of doing things very reliably at the moment, but just the raw economics. I mean, I would almost go far as to say that a bad engine deal, and by engine deal I'm talking about typically a transaction that relates to installed engines and spare engines in a new aircraft transaction, and also some form of support agreement, whether it be a PBH type agreement or some other. But if you end up making some mistakes there, the negative long-term economic impact on the airline, I would say generally would be more severe than if you made the same type of mistakes on the airframe side. So we as a group spend a lot of time working on that aspect. And I think just as it relates to that, I mean, when I was at Airbus and we were selling 320ceos, at the time we would typically say to an airline, so 320 versus 737, we'd typically say to the airline, pick the airframe, and if you happen to pick the Airbus airframe, then run an additional engine competition to try and get the best deal out of the engine manufacturers. That tune has changed over the years now, and it's both with single aisle and wide bodies, that pretty much in all competitions, when it flips between Airbus and Boeing, but you sort of end up in a scenario where one airframe has a choice of engines and the other airframe does not have a choice of engines. And in that scenario, we actually recommend now to our airline clients is you need to be prepared to make the airframe and the engine decision at the same time. Because if you don't, you cannot be assured that the engine manufacturer will then step up to the plate and give you the type of transaction that you're seeking. So it just means that the amount of work and effort that has to go in to make that decision is more, because you have to do all of that all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, you talk about the importance of, especially on the engine side, but, Courtney and I recently did an analysis on kind of looking at the overall kind of value / cost of the maintenance as in comparison to the new aircraft pricing. And it's interesting when you look at the trends over the last, and I can't remember if I ever looked at maybe the last 10 or 12 years, or but how that percentage has gone up, and it will continue to go up. Where I think it started was kind of in the, and what I'm talking about is kind of like the run out to full time, right? So ultimately the value of the full interval for everything. And, it was, I think initially on narrow bodies, it was kind of like 25, 26, 27%. And now we're getting close to 50% of the value of the air.
Are you adding, is that both airframe and engine in that case?
Correct. Yep. Yeah. And the airframe itself is
the engine percentage of the total, right?
I
guess in effect, right? Yeah, it's zero time to full run out to full time.
Yep.
But the airframe
and the airframe piece to that, on the value of the maintenance is a fraction of what the engines are, right? But I
fully agreed. Yeah.
So it just kind of show you the importance.
Absolutely, and I think what we're finding is, and there's a lot of focus on the GTF at the moment. Probably that's the most publicised engine that's got in-service issues, which is having an impact on the airlines, on the operators. But it's not the only engine that has issues. And my personal opinion, and I'm not an engine expert, but my personal opinion is it's sort of Airbus and Boeing fault, really, because they've pushed and pushed and pushed the engine manufacturers so hard. You've got to give me a better engine. You've got to give me a better engine. And the engine manufacturers have responded. But as a result of that, the level of technology that they have to incorporate into the engine, the level of tolerances that they have to design into the engine have gone down, and therefore the opportunities for the thing not to be durable have gone up. And I think we're very much seeing that. And as a result of that, if people look at this in detail, they're probably not going to like the answer. Just take the single aisle re-engineering program, so the Neo and the Max. And I don't know if you guys have done this, it'd be interesting to do. If you try to sort of net out sort of Neo versus CO and Max versus NG, just take the engine-related components, just fuel burn and engine maintenance, leave the airframe aside because it sort of nets out to zero. We're saving fuel, that's great. So we save fuel, which is a good thing, and we fly further and we can carry more payload, which is a good thing. Have we actually produced an aircraft that has a lower unit cost on that basis?
No. We haven't. We did that.
Yeah.
We haven't. So this is interesting because time marches on. But you're absolutely right. Just the increased engine maintenance costs have matched the fuel burn benefits in terms of cost at a given fuel price. You get the idea. A lot of variables in there, but time marches on, right? So this is where, and I love your comment about, because I wholly agree that the engine manufacturers have taken the hit for these challenges, while they're in the background being like, but we told you this would happen if we gave you what you wanted, and you said we don't care, and suddenly it's our fault, right? So I think that context is lost.
Okay, all right.
Well, to the point of we need better. Give me that 15% SFC improvement. Great. Here's 12, and we're matching your time on wing. Great. No, we need 15. Right, but our margins, right? We're going to be running it hotter. The time is not going to be as much, and out it goes, right? Granted, they were still delivered with those expectations of maintenance costs. Yet it was the airframers who were pushing.
So let's go back. So I need to be somewhat circumspect here in how I describe the information I have, based upon both the fact I was working for Airbus at the time and the fact that I'm in the business with a whole bunch of clients today. So I need to think about that, but we'll take that into account. But if I go back to when the Neo was launched in Airbus, and because I was head of marketing, I was sort of part of a big team of people that was involved in that business case and marketing plan. And first of all, if we start at the beginning, the reason why anything got re-engined at all is, in my personal view, because of the efforts of Pratt & Whitney, which I mean in a positive. I don't mean a negative way, I mean in a positive way. Airbus was not thinking about re-engineering the 320ceo at the time. Why would we? We had an airframe that was more modern than its competitor. So what was the logic? Market share was okay. I mean, it was 50-50-ish, plus or minus in a year. What's wrong with that? So it wasn't on the topic of things we needed to do. And Pratt & Whitney, to give credit to Pratt, came and knocked on the door and said, we've had this great idea. It's called a GTF and it's got a gearbox. So this is the linkage if I go back to my 146 history, right? So there's none now, but in that time there was still a few folks on the engineering side in Airbus who came out of BAE and therefore had intimate knowledge of the 146 and the fact that the geared engine was not great on that application. And so Airbus was not initially a receptive audience to Pratt & Whitney's marketing efforts regarding this engine. And there should be business case studies. Maybe they have been done on this, I don't know. But Pratt & Whitney did an extraordinarily good job. Every time Airbus came, we're not going to do it and it's not going to work and here's why. They just went back to East Hartford. They thought it through. They came back with a valid answer to that question. And that went on and on and on until, what typically happens in that scenario is the people who are the detractors initially ultimately become proponents because they become converted to the fact, wow, this thing actually might work. And then from an Airbus standpoint, by luck, I think, rather than design, the fact that the 320ceo sat higher off the ground than a 737NG, we thought, wow, this bigger fan, it's actually not that challenging. In fact, it's pretty easy to hang this thing off a 320. So that the premise at that point became, does it make any sense? Will we be successful if we launch initially with the GTF and then subsequently during the design phase, CFM came to the party a little bit later with the LEAP engine. And we, first of all, yes, we can do it. Can we do it? Yes. Do the economics look okay or good? Yes, and I don't quite remember the speech that you just described where the engine manufacturers were saying, we'll give you the fuel burn saving, but get ready because you're not going to like the maintenance cost. I don't quite remember it being pitched that way, to be honest with you. But anyway, it looked like it would make sense. And quite honestly, and I think it's okay to say this, we felt that it would simply because of the age of the airframe program and because of the geometry of the 737NG, we just felt that it would be harder for Boeing to make that transition if they chose to do so. And as a result of that, we felt that the product positioning of the 320, specifically the 320, versus the 737-800 would likely be improved if both airframe manufacturers decided to do re-engineering. And not to turn it into an Airbus versus Boeing thing, but I mean, I actually think the MAX 8's a great aeroplane, tell you the truth. But just from a point of view of fan size, it's true that because of the geometry, the engine on the Neo has a bigger fan size than the engine on the MAX, which felt like it was a good thing to Airbus. So we became quite committed to the fact that re-engineering would make sense to us. Now, we had no prediction at all regarding the longer-term success of the 320 family program, the number of sales, the number of deliveries, and especially with the 321, we just didn't see that coming. I mean, the 321 always had good economics because it's a stretch from what I said before, and it lacked a bit of range. And the fact that with the Neo, everyone fell in love with the 321 Neo and continues to do so today. I think plan is for more than half of all the Neos to be built as 321s in the future. I don't remember us predicting that at the time, but I think it's the way the single aisle market is headed.
And if you think about that original, I mean, just to completely oversimplify here, it sits higher, so we can do it, and the 7.3 is going to have a harder time. That simple just because of the height of the room under the wing, that simple variable there, that simple measurement, ultimately led to pretty much a lot of the challenges that Boeing has had with the 737, putting the engine, moving it forward, the effects of the CG, the requirement for MCAS, right? The other issues. So that very simple kind of advantage that was kind of appreciated in the early 2010s by way of room under the wing has really played itself out through a ton of other side effects and kind of other areas.
Yeah, so I mean, not appropriate for me to get into the Max in that sense. And again, genuinely, from a competitive, as I look at the economics of the different aircraft out there, the Max 8 looks good. The Max 10, I think, looks very good if Boeing get it out. Again, for the reasons it's a stretch, and if there is not an ultimate range requirement, I mean, Max 10 looks very, very good indeed. My perception of what happened, and I don't know, and I don't mean to represent what Boeing may have known. All I can tell you is what I was hearing at the time. I mean, I was one of the guys that would stand up and present at conferences for Airbus, and obviously it would be typically Airbus and Boeing. So did that on many occasions. And so we internally, we were pretty committed. We hadn't launched, but we were pretty committed. The re-engineering was looking better and better from our standpoint. And at the time, Boeing were very much saying their strong preference was to do a new aircraft program. And we found that puzzling on our side for a very simple reason. It's not complicated at all. We simply said, okay, because we know we're going to do the re-engineering, we're going to move the baseline from the economics of the CO and fuel burn and range predominantly. We're going to move it. Let's just stick to fuel because it's easiest. That 15% improvement, that's going to be the new baseline. If Boeing are going to do an all-new plane, is it conceivable that they can produce something which is sufficiently improved? They can certainly make it look good against the CO, but can it look good enough? Can it be another 20% better than a Neo? And at the time, we felt the technologies were not there. Either the architecture and or the technologies, obviously the engine, were not there to be able to do that. And that does seem to have been proven to be the case. I mean, it will happen eventually, without a question of a doubt, but it didn't seem to be the case at the time. So we felt that there was quite a strong chance that Boeing ultimately would decide to also re-engine the NG into the Max, and that's in the end that's what happened. But again, it wasn't there was no other. I mean, I've heard other people say, "Oh well, the Neo was to keep the C series at bay." I've got to tell you, the C series it was on like the third page of the nice things that might happen if Airbus launched the Neo. It really was as simple as that. The engine and then engines were there. It was an easy program industrially, and we didn't need to mess around too much with wings or landing gear or anything else. So it was relatively easy and straightforward to do. There was a market appetite for an aircraft that burnt less fuel and flew a bit further. And at the time, we felt it might put our competitor into quite a difficult position in terms of the decisions that they had to make. But there was no other reasons behind it. I had no clue it was going to be as successful as it's become.
Yeah. So if you think about some of the things that are going on, obviously with Boeing today, right? Some of the issues that everybody seems to be having issues, especially on the engine side, but Boeing is definitely, I think, struggling the last couple of months with some of the issues that they've had. What do you think they could or should do, looking at the issues that they have today, especially on the, when you look at the Max, how do you get out of that, right? How do you kind of keep going so that ultimately, you build the airplanes that you're meant to build, you certify the aircraft that are supposed to get certified, like what needs to be done to get them out of this kind of industry funk that they're in today?
Let me offer that same question through a little bit of role playing. You get a call from Calhoun this afternoon. He's like, "Look, Andy, all I want to do is retire. I need you to step in. You're the only guy I can think of. You're running Boeing. You can't say no. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do, Andy? Besides say no.
No, well. First of all, genuinely, I'm not qualified to answer the question. So I don't really think I can answer. First of all, I don't want to be CEO of anything. So that's not going to happen. And secondly, I'm not qualified to answer the question. I mean, I think, and I'm actually, I'm without a shadow of a doubt. There's no one in Boeing, just as there's no one in Airbus that sort of wakes up one morning and says, let's not do this because we think it'll be quicker. That's just not the way. Aeroplanes don't get designed that way. I would say, and again, rather than answer the question, I'd rather flip it around to things I'm more familiar with, is when it comes to everything to do with building and certifying aircraft, well, certainly safety comes first, that's for sure. The second thing is from a design standpoint, it's all a trade-off. Everything is a trade-off. When you're trying to figure out what to do with a particular aircraft, you can always decide to make it fly further or be more efficient or carry more people or put in an extra exit or whatever. But there's always a trade-off to making that decision. So the whole philosophy of what you're going to do and when you're going to do it is a series of trade-off studies. To try and answer the question just a little bit, I mean, I think only the efforts and the passage of time will help to move the MAX from its current position. I mean, current positioning in the public domain and the PR domain doesn't look great, that's for sure. And then I sort of read like in the last 24 hours, I think the press was saying, another blow to Boeing, and it was like a nose wheel came off a 757.
A 757.
Yeah, I know.
So it's tough. It's a tough spot.
It really is. Yeah, media is terrible.
It's a tough spot to be in, and I think there has to be a passage of time where nothing bad happens. Is what it boils down to. And if people happen to order more Maxes in the interim, that's probably a bonus at the same time. And I'm sure that they're really doing everything they possibly can to remedy the situation at the moment. But I'm not really qualified to say.
No, absolutely, yeah. I mean, and look, from there, when you're investing that much money into a product that carries people around, right? You're not just going to be, as you say, just kind of go, well, we won't worry about that. Like, what's the chance of that happening again?
Yeah.
We'll take that chance, right? I mean, that you don't let that happen. I think you just kind of go, what happened? What went wrong? How do we fix it so that we don't have to worry about it going forward, right? And I think that's exactly what they're doing. You just have the criticism of the media and everything else, and you've got the FAA that is being very cautious these days because everybody's looking at them too. And so that just adds to everything, right? But in the end, I think, a couple of months from now, the fix will have been put in place, right? Airplanes will be flying again, and then we're focused on something else.
I want to take the opportunity.
I'd quite happily fly on a MAX today, no issues of
no, absolutely.
Of any sort.
Now, okay, would you sit in that seat though?
Yes. I'm not totally sure I'd release the seatbelt.
There's no way. Well, look, I do want to acknowledge that answer, how both incredibly boring and accurate it is, because I do think you are absolutely right. The passage of time is what it is. When you get into the nuance of manufacturers, you clearly know there's nobody that's saying, I'm just gonna phone it in today. I'll leave these bolts off. Nobody will notice, right? That's just not the case. Now, there are systemic or maybe cultural issues, but again, who doesn't, and to this level, but still, like the passage of time, I don't think people fully appreciate today. Clearly not in the news cycle and in our short-term memories. I don't think it's fully appreciated how much the passage of time itself will fix this. Now, that being said, I also said that after the MAX returned to the air, and yet here we are. So maybe it's a bit longer passage of time than, sans other issues.
Yeah. So there's a topic we haven't touched on, and I just think that most people don't really think about it. And I actually think it's quite it's misunderstood or not understood very well. And this applies to both Airbus and Boeing, as we're sort of talking about production and how you build planes and how you get them out the door, is the fact that Boeing and Airbus, and they've had decades and decades to do this, have perfected the ability to build aircraft in quantity. Whether you're building 30 or 50 or 75 a month, it's still a lot of planes to me. To build them in quantity, cost effectively to a number of different specifications for a number of different airlines, and that's one of the barriers to entry. Because we haven't talked about that, of like, well, it's okay, Airbus and Boeing are not doing a great job of servicing the market to some extent. Customers are not necessarily happy with either Airbus or Boeing or the engine manufacturers for different reasons. So why doesn't an Elon Musk step in and do a Tesla in large commercial jets? And the answer to that question is, other than the fact it would take a humongous amount of money and 20 years to see any return on it, is just the ability to build planes in quantity is really, really, really difficult. And that's where I think the other manufacturers, whether the smaller ones today, whether they be Chinese or Russian or Japanese or Brazilian even, really find it difficult. And I don't really think either Airbus or Boeing are given the credit that they probably deserve for the efforts they've had to put in to make that happen. I mean, if the supply chain's creaking for sure, but if a program I know best, if you think that, did I ever think that Airbus might achieve, rate 50 today and rate 75?
Yeah.
Wow, over 2 a day. That's unbelievable. The year I joined Airbus, or maybe the year after, I forget which, annual total sales for Airbus for the year was 18 aircraft. And the original business case, I wasn't there at the time, but I've heard this, I think it's a true story. The original A320, well, it wasn't known as the CEO, it was just the A320 at the time. The original business case the program was launched on was on the basis that it would sell between 700 and 800 over the course of its whole program life. And how many thousands are they at now? So the OEMs, they struggle from time to time for different reasons. I mean, Airbus A380 is probably the most notable one in terms of being able to build the thing and get it out the door. But Airbus and Boeing are extremely good at that. It's very, very difficult for anyone else to get to those levels of volume.
But let's think about the implications of that, because I do think I agree with that entirely, right? The true differentiator today is the ability to produce and scale. It's what Comac is staring down the barrel of, right? And there's a real question if they'll be able to do that with the reliability. I have no idea if they will, but Boeing and Airbus absolutely have, even with their current challenges. But if you look back through history, that has not been the differentiator. And it's partly because we were on the steeper end of the curve of technological disruption, where you had the DC-6 and the 707 was so much different than the DC-6, and then DC-10 was so much better than that, and the 777, right? So we moved high bypass, all these type of technological improvements, and now they're incremental. So if we're getting 15% each time, now that 15% is a lot smaller. And it's shifted to production. Wholly agree. But I think what's being missed in the industry are the expectations then that, and I think this falls on the criticism of Boeing. I'm criticizing the criticism of Boeing that says they have to do something. They have to build a new airplane. I disagree. They do not have to. They'll go back and say, well, they've done a new program this many times. After this many years, they do a new program. It is different now. You're not getting the technological leaps that you were getting. The numbers are smaller because we've gotten to that point, and there's more benefit to the ability to produce over what you're getting. I mean, it's probably a big reason why they re-engined the latest round of narrow-body aircraft as opposed to all new design. I agree wholly, just the real advantage of production, but then that also slows new development down as well.
Yeah, so, I mean, there will be, if we think about what is most likely to happen, is the wide-body space, there's, other than the 777X getting into service, everything's out there already. Everyone knows what everyone's doing. Everything's pretty new. I'd even loosely call a 330neo new, if you know what I mean. Not quite like a 350, but But I don't really expect anything to happen in that space for a long time to come. I think there is a question mark, and it is a question mark. I don't have the answer in the single aisle space for the simple reason that, leaving current issues aside, that, well, two things really. The 737, from its establishment, the airframe platform on which the aircraft program is built is a decade or more older than when did the first 737 enter service? 320 was 88.
It was like 1777, I think.
Yeah,
right
so,
the Tea Party
yeah.
And the second point, it was built in the 60s, right? It was designed in the 60s, yeah.
Right. But then the second point is, what they've done a tremendous job of is they've re-engined it 3 times already. We're on the 4th. You had the original, you had the classic, you got the NG and the Max. So we're on, will there be a 5th? I think that seems quite unlikely to me. And therefore, it's most likely, and it might work the other way around, who knows, but it's most likely that when all the stars align, and there's a market. Would people buy it if you could produce an aeroplane today that was 20% better than the best thing that you can get today in the single aisle space? Would people buy it? And the answer is they would, because they're always looking to get one up on their competition, if nothing else. So they would. And then the question is, well, can you see that happening? And it looks as if it's going to require a bigger departure from the norm. Could it be an aeroplane? All aeroplanes look alike now, pretty much, don't they? They're all sort of low wing, 2 engines slung under the wing type, irrespective whether you're a 120-seater or a 300-seater. They sort of all look alike. Is it possible that the next program, if we loosely agree, it probably should be somewhere in the single aisle space? Do we think it could look like that again? And I think what you might be saying, Courtney, is probably not, because I just don't see we're reaching that asymptote in technology. We've already got, if you go, I'm not an aeronautical engineer, but I think you can just go back to the fundamentals of, to make a plane better, you've got, how can you do that? You can make the aerodynamics better. Well, not a lot you can do. We're pretty much there. There isn't much more you can do. I mean, wings are incredibly efficient. It's amazing how efficient current wing technology is. Weight. Well, we've just gone to all carbon fiber. So is there something beyond carbon fiber that makes the structure a whole lot lighter? It doesn't seem like it. And by the way, the modern engines are heavier than the older ones because they're bigger, so they're physically heavier. So there isn't much to do there under the current regime. And then you're back to, well, it's got to be more radical than that. So it's an unducted fan of some sort, which is not in itself a new idea. That probably has to get hung off the aircraft in a different manner than the existing aeroplanes, and that presents an opportunity or a need to be more radical. And not blended wing bodies, they've been looked at for a long time. They've got pluses and minuses. Supersonic demonstrators, that's great, but that's not going to be taking you from Washington, D.C. to New York anytime soon. So I think it's probably Boeing, you would think logically, that would be putting more focus on that side of the business as to what comes next. But what it might look like or the timing of it, hopefully I'm around to see it. I don't know. It feels as if it's a way off at the moment, I must admit.
It feels as if it's a way off, yet at the same time, like you said, there also is nothing in between here and there.
Yeah,
it's this.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Garrick and I were talking before you joined about the likelihood of, keeping along the same lines, the likelihood of re-engineering wide bodies. Yeah, that sounds about right. Sure. I mean, there's probably a generation of re-engine that you can fit on those wide body airframes. I don't know anything. But on the narrow body, I mean, look, the 737 fuselage is a 707 fuselage, right? This was built in the 50s. And it still works. That's not a bad thing. It still works. The fuse works for a reason, right? And it's those production reasons.
Yeah, and the fuselage is the one thing. If you think about everything that gets changed in any aircraft program, you can change the wing, you can change the engines, you can change the tail, you can shrink, you can stretch, you can change the landing gear. That you're stuck with it. That fuselage dimension, you're stuck with that for the whole program. and it won't change. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with you in terms of new build wide bodies. I mean, it's the very new 350, 787s, soon 777X, albeit that's a heavily reworked, I would describe, re-engine program. I don't see other engine options coming on those platforms for a long, long time to come, because, I mean, traditionally, the airframe manufacturer doesn't really subsidize, I would say, the engine manufacturer's design, and the engine manufacturer has to spend an awful lot of money designing the engine in the first place. Mm-hmm. So there's not a lot of motivation, I wouldn't have thought, for said engine manufacturers to try and obsolete something for which they've probably not recovered the money they've spent on it yet. Nor do I think the technology's there either. So I think we'll have 787s and 350s for a long time to come.
Yeah, I think one of the discussions that we were having about just that, about the re-engineering, was more, if Airbus all of a sudden realizes that the A350-1000 is not quite meeting, or is less of a competitor with the 777-9, that may push Airbus to look at maybe an even stretched version of 1000 to be able to better compete. And does that mean, you need to have a higher thrust engine to be able to do that? And so that to me would be one of the few scenarios that would push maybe Airbus to re-engine the A350 at some point to be able to better compete with the 777-9 if it does what it's supposed to do, right?
The weird thing, I looked at this recently, the weird thing is, and I'm talking at the macro level, and I know in reality individual decisions can be quite different, but if you just look at the macro level, single aisle aircraft are getting bigger and wide body aircraft are getting smaller. And obviously on the single aisle side, it's because of the popularity of the 321 more than anything else. And if you look on the wide body side, it's because of the end of the 380s and 747s, and therefore, will there be a need? It's a strange thing with the 350, and I actually don't know how Airbus did it. They almost pulled a rabbit out of the hat, in my opinion. They've made the 350-1000 as a stretch, and therefore with generally I would describe good unit economics. It flies a heck of a long way. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was on one on Tuesday and it was 15 and a half hours, and we were not doing any Maydays due to lack of fuel. So that I didn't really predict that. It's unusual to be. The 350-1000, I believe, flies further than a 350-900. So forget the 350-900 ULR, which is a particular aircraft with a particular configuration. Just your standard 350-900 versus 350-1000. You would normally expect that the stretch would be probably the best part of 1,000 miles less range than the base version, the 900, and that's not the case with the 1000. So as a variant, it feels as if it's gaining a bit of traction at the moment. But I think on your point, there's obviously many wide body competitions in the future where, for example, in many cases, the 777 would be the incumbent. It was the existing 777-300ER replacement, and I guess the time frame for many of those replacement requirements has not quite arrived yet. And then the question at that time is, the airlines in question, hopefully we'll be advising some of them, are they seeking an aircraft which has the payload capabilities of a 777-300 plus a bit more, or are they looking for something which has the same or a bit less? And I don't know the answer to that question yet.
Yeah. There's no engine that I know of that even has been developed or is on the drawing board to be that re-engineering. So certainly there's no suggestion that they're looking at doing that now.
No, of course not.
It's just that what else would they do before that? I don't see anything, right? That's kind of the only other next step before we get to the entire next generation of whatever is going to be.
I mean, generally, if you're in a scenario where you've got an aircraft which is out there and your competitor is not out there yet, your best plan of attack is just to go for it and get as many aircraft sold as you possibly can. Because every time, in simple terms, every time you sell one, it means your competitor can't sell their version to the same airline for the next 15 or 20 years. So, and I think in all likelihood with the single aisle, probably, because we're back to that question about what will happen in the future. If I was in Airbus today, I think the evidence by the rate ramp up perhaps supports this, is I would just try to get as many Neos out there as I possibly could, because every time I get somebody that's just taken delivery of the 321 Neo is not an obvious candidate for in 5-10 years time for the replacement, if there is one, of a 737 MAX. And I think the same argument could apply on the wide body side as well.
That's an interesting way to look at it, particularly back to the production as a competitive weapon and putting your kind of it's different engineering. It's more mechanical engineering than or industrial engineering than it is kind of traditional aerodynamic engineering and that sort, but structural engineering. But it's a competitive advantage. So a question I have for you, Andy. A trivia question, more so, with no right answer. Of the new aircraft delivering today, we can stick wide bodies. Pound for pound, dollar for dollar, really is what I want to ask. Dollar for dollar, what airplane provides the best utility today in the wide body side, new off the production line? What do you think is the most overlooked kind of workhorse?
I mean, hey, I advise airlines, and every time it's different. So there isn't. I know I'm not doing a great job of answering your question, but there really isn't an answer to that question because it varies on the airline to airline. If there was an answer to the question, everyone would only buy that plane, and that's not the case. So it really depends. Maybe as I've done a number of times, I'll try and not answer the question, but say something else instead. One thing that we find in evaluations, it's always been the case, and I don't see this changing anytime soon, is, in simple terms, revenue trumps cost. So if you have two different aeroplanes of fundamentally different revenue generating capability, because one's a bit bigger than the other one, or maybe has more range, and therefore you can take more payload further and carry more cargo or whatever, I mean, generally that comes with a higher trip cost because you're carrying more metal around the sky. If you've got aircraft of same economic efficiency, vintage, and therefore the ultimate winner in that scenario is within the hands of the airline as to how they choose, because they should not be buying aeroplanes on the basis of the lowest seat mile cost. I mean, that's flying empty seats around at the lowest unit cost doesn't do you much of a favour. So the way they analyse the revenue is critical to what they think is the right answer to your question. It's not what's the most efficient plane, it's what's the most profitable plane, and that has to reflect on the revenue capability. Wide body, from an investor standpoint, I'd say the 787-9 is still the most popular asset to own. It's well known now. It's highly efficient. Flies a long way. It's not too big, and it's reliable. It's got at least one, if not two, decent engines, and it does what it says on the tin. So I believe I'm just representing what the market perception is, and I would agree with that today. Now, I'm not suggesting that the 350-900 is not a great plane too. I was just trying to give you a single answer as opposed to a dual answer. I tend to look more at order books, perhaps because of my background, order books and production rates, because that really tells us what the market's doing. I mean,
sure,
they're not building speculative wide bodies, I can assure you of that. So they're in effect, every wide body is built to order is what it boils down to. And the 330neo is just not coming off the shelves like hotcakes. I mean, they're trying to get to, I don't think they're there quite yet, but they're trying to get to a rate of 4 a month, which is not very many.
Right.
And the 350 and the 787 are closer to 10 a month in both cases. Yeah. So it looks as if it's not doing great. Now, I think it's probably true that for the airlines that operate it, it's it's a highly efficient aircraft for them. But the question from a market standpoint is, does it have a sort of wide market application? And I was there. I was at Airbus during the launch of the 330neo. I mean, it wasn't a terribly complicated decision, because we felt at the time that we'd figured out how to re-engine an aircraft with a single aisle, and therefore how tough can it be to re-engine a 330, and therefore elongate the lifespan of the 330 program. And the 330neos are certainly doing that. And I think probably at the end of the day, there's a fair price gap between the 330neo and the 350 or the 787. So that's sort of like Airbus gets to decide that, in effect, as to how they pitch the aeroplane into the market. I think what Airbus would tell you, if you asked them, is that and it's probably true, that the replacement cycle for most of the 330ceos has not quite come around yet. What happened, if you remember, on 330ceo is 330-200, when it was launched, was really quite effective at competing against the 767, so it became the favoured variant. But then through time, as the takeoff weight capability of the 330ceo increased, it made the 300 fly further, and then the 300 suddenly became the aircraft in favour, which has continued now, and therefore there's a stack of younger 330-300s when it was the aircraft that was most favoured. You know, Delta bought it. You can still fly on those today, transatlantic, for example. And therefore, when the 330neo was launched, and it's the case today, that it's very much the 900 is the favoured aircraft and the 800 is not. So there's still a whole bunch of 330-300s to replace. And then the question is, you know, how does Airbus position the 330neo versus the 350? And I think it's horses for courses, how they choose to do that, and what the level of competition is. Does that airline maybe already operate 787s, for example, in addition to 330-300? So every case is different. But from a sort of program success criteria, I mean, I think it's tough to say the program's hugely successful when you're building for a month. That's not a very high volume for a wide body program.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's probably just more of a, I think of it as more of a timing issue, right? I think if the Neo was being launched and was going to enter service in the next few years, I think they would be different, because you probably have airlines that are going through the replacement cycle of their A330ceos, right? But as you say, there was a lot of airplanes, and I know Courtney's done that analysis of looking at kind of how many aircraft were built in the 13, 14, 15, 16 timeframe, and it's a huge amount of airplanes.
Yeah, they're like 10 years old, yeah.
Right, so those airplanes now are like 10 or less years old, and so, yeah, you still probably have another good, you know, in some cases, probably another good 6 years before you really start looking at, okay, we really need to, you know, get rid of this airplane, because then you're dealing with some heavier checks. But so that, I think from a timing issue, you know, it's not quite there yet. But when airlines start looking at that, right, unless the market shifted towards a much bigger airplane or a much more capable airplane, I think there's no reason why you wouldn't see kind of a ramp up in the demand. But it's still probably a few years away.
But it's certainly true as a passenger, and I don't think airlines necessarily buy aircraft on the basis of what their passengers' preferences are. But you know, passengers, you're not aware. You get into a new 330-900. You don't sort of say, boy, this feels like it's old. That's not the impression that it doesn't quite have the. I genuinely am a bit of a convert, I must admit. Having done a fair bit of flying on 787s and 350s, I think there's something to be said for the lower cabin altitude. And they're incredibly quiet machines, and they're very stable. So on these long-haul flights, I actually think there is a bit of a difference in the passion. I don't mean it's a bad experience in a 330neo. I just think there is a little bit of a difference in the 787 and also the A350.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a wildly successful program, because the other aircraft I also put in this category are like the 76400, like just an ASK machine, right? I mean, my goodness, you know, transatlantic range, just, I mean, the best economics you can get on a bird like that to use to its full potential. And there were, I don't know, less than 100 of those that were built. And they continue to fly, and they continue to make a lot of money for Delta and United. I don't know who else.
They just announced that they're not retiring those anytime soon.
No, of course not.
Yeah,
I think the 753, same thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that may have been a little bit of a stretch too far, the 757-300. Great unit costs, but you better not have a tight connection if you're sitting in row 45. I mean, if you actually think how long it takes to get off from the back end of the 757-300 as a very, very long single-aisle aircraft, it's an incredibly long time. So, I mean, I think that probably was a little bit of a stretch too far.
Not getting rid of them anytime soon, but on the other hand,
right, so
they didn't sell a bunch either.
Yes. Yep.
Right? And again, the 330neo does not have that problem. I'm not hugely bullish on the 330neo. I really like where that aircraft is positioned for more than one reason. One, their ability to just offer it cheaply, but also for the price protection it offers the 350. Right? There has to be some benefit there of, you want a 350? Oh, you want it cheaper? Well, we have the 330neo. Oh, you actually do want the 350. Oh, okay, well, it's this price then.
So there is a price differential, and so Airbus gets to choose how they offer the aircraft, and then the airline gets to choose how they evaluate the different economic options. It does sometimes create confusion, though, I think. Just the fact that, loosely speaking, Airbus have two different aircraft that sort of do the same thing. Yeah. I mean, you can try Trans-Pacific in a 330-900, not quite as long range as a 350, but people do it. And so it's sort of, it can create confusion regarding, and how the aircraft is marketed as well, therefore, can be a little bit confusing. I mean, it was again, just historically, it was certainly the case when at Airbus, you're trying to market an A380 at the same time as you're trying to say, big is what you need here and here's why. And then maybe you're trying to market, I know it's a totally different animal, but a 320ceo, which is a little bit smaller than a 737-800, you say, no, trip cost is what really matters here. Don't get obsessed with seat mile costs. I mean, it can be the art of marketing, but it can be very confusing. And I think that's the simplicity sort of the single aisle competition. It's very much, it's just like the old days. It's a head-to-head Neo versus Max, and the wide body competition, there's 4 different aircraft programs there really, in 2 from Boeing and 2 from Airbus. So there's all sorts of different variables that you can look at, which if nothing else bifurcates the market a little bit more.
Yeah, well, and I do think that's one of the reasons probably why we won't see kind of the next generation narrow body anytime real soon, because I think there is that feeling from whether it's Airbus or Boeing to go, well, if we launch something first, we provide a baseline for the other guys to come up with something better. So let's, unless we have to do something, let's wait for the other person to make the move, and kind of probably looking at both, each other kind of saying the same thing, because it's true. Ultimately, if you come up with a product and it's 20% better, as the competitor, you're going to go, all right, so how can we, tweak that and make that better so that all of a sudden we have a leg up? And so it's a waiting game.
So you raise an interesting question, and I'll touch on it. Now, I'm conscious I think we might be running over time, and I'm pretty sure my earpods will run out of juice fairly soon. But just on that point, so if we little bit of history here, but if we think about at the time when the 787 was launched, what happened is before that, at the time Boeing were promoting initially the Sonic Cruiser, and I can genuinely say in Airbus we just didn't see the logic, or there was no smoke and mirrors going on. We just felt at the time, hang on a minute, why would you design an aeroplane to fly just below Mach 1 when the drag imposed at that Mach number is really bad? I mean, you're better at 0.8, 0.85 or above 1, but not 0.95. Now, I know there's business jets that fly around at very high Mach numbers, but that was the genuine feeling in Airbus. So we didn't really feel at the time that aeroplane was particularly serious. It may have been inside Boeing, but we didn't think that. And then when that sort of got put on the back burner, and Boeing came up with the 787, and they said, well, we're going to do we're going to, I forget how they described it, but basically let the world decide what to call the aircraft. And actually, I think Dreamliner was a very good name in the end. But we thought, boy, that sounds like a bit of a marketing ploy. So we completely underestimated the seriousness with which Boeing was addressing that segment of the market in the aeroplane that became the 787. And I know there were issues in terms of the way it was launched and in what have you. But I mean, it became a very serious aircraft very quickly, and Airbus was not perhaps ready for that. And that's when Airbus, and I was there, came up with 350 Mark 1, which ironically is sort of a lot like a 330neo today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
We were out there pitching that aircraft versus 787, and we were losing campaigns. And then ultimately the market speaks. You can persuade yourself as much as you like that you've got a great aircraft and a great product offering, but if not the right people are buying it, you've got to change. You've got to go back to the drawing board. And just on your point, that's when in Airbus we said, well, okay, the only good news is we actually know exactly what the competitor's doing. So let's take that as the benchmark and let's try and make something which is a little bit better. I'm not saying that Airbus achieved something which is better, but it certainly was part of the criteria of trying to figure out what to do. And then if you think about what really happened, which I think is quite interesting, is, I mean, originally the 350 XWB, extra wide body. I mean, we were pushing cabin drawings, Lopers out there with a super luxurious, super comfortable 8 abreast economy because we'd been successful with the 320. So okay, let's do that again. Let's produce a plane which is a bit wider than the competitor, and let's tell everyone that you're going to have a more comfortable passenger experience. But the economics soon took over, and the 350 quickly became a 9 abreast aircraft. And then the 787, also with most airlines, I think, for example, JAL still fly a 787 abreast, but most airlines certainly choose 9 abreast as the basic criteria. So both aircraft flipped in that case, where perhaps economy, passenger comfort, sadly took a bit of a backseat, and the economics came to the fore. But that is the only advantage in coming second, I would say, is that you have a better understanding about the aircraft that you're competing with.
Yeah, I remember at this time as well, when it was the 7E7, the big debate wasn't 787 versus 350 or anything like that. It was 380 versus the 380 philosophy versus the 787 velocity.
Yeah.
Philosophy.
Yeah.
Which I mean clearly played out over the following 15 years.
Yeah. Well, Andy, we're as you said, we're definitely over a little bit here, but it's definitely been worthwhile. So, but we wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk to us and kind of let you know your background and how you got to where you are today, and then obviously share your views on what's going on. Certainly kind of wish you the best of when your new role with Seabury, and kind of you guys seem to have a great team, so keep that going. But we'd love to chat with you again at some point if you're up to it. Just kind of it's always enjoyable to talk about the industry. So
it's been fabulous. Thank you. You can see certainly it's what I love doing. Probably more than anything else is I get to talk, and that's what I get to do as a day job. Even better is talk about aeroplanes all day long. So thank you very much for the time. I hope I've got as much runway ahead of me as I have behind me, but I suspect from a career standpoint that's probably not the case. But I look forward to my second invitation when I'm 126, I guess, in the years to come.
Well, that sounds great. Thanks, Andy.
All the best. Thank you.
I mean, at least you're in focus today. That's a good thing.
Hold my beer. I watch this.
Window seats are too cold.
You just kind of get into that window seat, and then you kind of lean one direction, which depends on which side of the airplane you're on. If you're on the right side of the airplane, you would lean to the right. If you're on the left side of the airplane, you would lean to the left. It's important not to get that wrong because it's really awkward if you forget that simple rule.
Yeah.